work session for the City Council this week. Starting us off, does anybody have review? We'll start with review agenda items for regular meeting and attachments. Anybody have any questions or anything we need to address off the regular agenda? Signing and thinking at the same time. Okay. All right, then, let's move on to item number 2. We have our special guest with us. It's the first Tuesday of the month, so welcome, Bob Schroeder. We appreciate that you prepare our homework for us and then come to grade our paper.
Okay. I've been here enough. I'm not that special anymore.
Well, you're still welcome.
Well,
special or not.
You've probably noticed from the outline you got that the farther we go, the less I'm spoon feeding you. And the more I'm just asking you to draw it out, because it seems to me that when you have a basis like Carver's model here, and you bring it from your perspective and your experience and your work, then it's the most valuable then. So I see, again, this textbook as more than a model. I trust it, yet we each have to personalize it. So told Jared it's all about him today. Isn't that fun? And let me compliment you all. And I know this is an educational setting of sorts, but it turns into work, and you take it and you make it work. But the fact that the council can sit here with staff back here observing, with him in the room, and talk about his role. I mean, this is maybe not for you so much, but for some boards, it's a huge step. Just the openness and the honesty of what should we be expecting and how to monitor and all those things. So it speaks of high trust, and I give you accolades for that. So my intent today would be to work hard at the outline items through 2C, and maybe from that point on, at worst, you'll need to come back to that later. It's not that it's unimportant, but it's more specifics, and when it comes time to put on paper policies that will define your relationship with the city manager, the CEO, then you can come back for that later. Okay, so I'm going to turn back to start with, just to open our thinking up a little bit. I'm going to ask you, after I tell you a little bit, a rehash of my story, but I want to ask you, without any finger pointing or any animosity or anything or any names, think about your worst board experience in the past and how, if it was, related to the board CEO relationship. And maybe you've never thought about it, but as you do, as I talk, maybe it'll come to you. And we don't all have to talk, and if there's only one, that's fine too. And I don't want to dwell on the negative, but it'll kind of help open the door to where we want to go today, I think. So our very first time together, I shared with you my experience as a staff member at a church, and even 34 years ago was a large church. It was a church that had no idea what its governance was, and it had a CEO / senior minister who didn't really know, other than pastoring and loving people, didn't know his role as a leader related to the board. And again, I take that all as just uneducation. Just nobody was aware. No ill intent, no bad hearts. It just was that way. I remember the extremes of my experience as a lowly staff member went from my very first month I was employed, January of '84, and all of our ministers were invited to come to the general board meeting. That was the elders, deacons combined with the trustees, just to listen, which maybe is good, maybe is bad. So my wife and I show up to Amarillo, 7 months pregnant, and with no insurance. So with me in the room, the board brings up the topic. Bob's on our staff now. They're going to have a baby in 2 months, and they don't have any insurance. What should we do? And I'm sitting there in the room going, whoa, this is kind of tough, And one guy spoke up and said, we need to do the right thing. Pay for that baby. And they all voted yes. I went, phew, And it wasn't so much that they said yes. It was like, they're going to talk about me personally in front of everybody, So years down the road, same policy or practices in place where staff members are invited to be at the general board meeting. And that was my good side. This is my bad side. And so I had been told that there were raises coming for the staff. So with staff in the room, they bring it up and vote no. And so I go to these extremes, and I'm going, I wish I had somebody standing up for me right now, as that staff member. And there you go, Jared. I mean, that's him. That's his role. That's any CEO's role, at least, a tiny little part of it, is to be that person who is there for the staff, yet really his or her first obligation is to the directives of the board and the limitations of the board. And so really much of the detail of this chapter this week comes back to how do you, in a work sense and in a personal sense, relate with each other. So now I'm going to go somewhere with that, make a point of that, but let me stop and say, has somebody thought of a situation you've been a part of in the past that was really connected between board and CEO? And it could be good. I said your worst. It could be either. Any other board experience where you go, well, I need to learn from that?
I think my worst experience was CEO had these goals and this risk tolerance, and board had this risk tolerance, which greatly meant they had different goals. Mm-hmm. So, he felt frustrated that they didn't want to move, and we felt frustrated that he kept moving. So.
Yeah. Okay, good example. Anybody else?
Several work experience.
Just one.
Not just one worst.
Pull his microphone. There you go.
Here, but that's on the school board where the superintendent was caught lying. We eventually paid him off. So that got pretty rough.
Now, I'm assuming that was at least an assumed limitation or prudence policy.
Yeah.
No lying.
Right.
Okay.
Remind us to put that on our anything but list. Achieve your goals without no lying, no dishonesty, no cooking of the books.
Yeah. Okay, so where we're headed today is our goals are to define the CEO role. Secondly, to learn the kind of information the board needs for responsible oversight and evaluation of the CEO. And third, to learn how to keep the roles of board and CEO separate and complementary. So here's a statement that Carver makes. And tell me how much you agree with it. In the introduction on your outline, it says, no single relationship in the organization is as important as that between the board and its CEO. It sets the stage for effective governance and management. Is that a 5 true or a 9 true?
It's true.
Okay. You want to tell us why?
Because the board hires the CEO, and we outline his or her responsibilities. So, but we give him the authority to make decisions, hire people, etc. So we have to have working relationship.
So if a board and its CEO has a really stellar relationship, how will the public know?
They probably won't.
That's what I have in my notes, handwritten.
They probably won't, because things will, you know, typically what you deal with are problems, and you don't deal with, when things are running smooth, you don't hear a lot of, it's kind of like your car. When your engine's running great, you know, you don't hear anything. But Tina tells me there's something that's not right about her car, and I drive it, and I think it might be okay, but she goes, it's not okay. And then it turns out, yeah, the radiator's about to go out on the thing. And so it's unless there's a problem, yeah, I don't think you typically are going to see, it's actually not going to make a lot of noise.
Yeah, I just sat in on a live conference this morning, and the discussion was, how do we know when people have a good experience at church? Well, they don't notice the lights, they don't notice the video, they don't notice the sound, and you name it, all the things they don't notice. And all the distractions were taken away so they could have a good experience. And so I think that's kind of the same thing you just said, which is when it's really good, that means people aren't hearing about it. And that's where your humility comes in, and you just have to say, hey, city manager did a good job, we did a good job. We're internally kind of proud of ourselves for that, but nobody knows it. And you've humbly served and moved on at some point. Public doesn't see it, but they will see the results, because that relationship will empower the CEO to work with confidence and the right amount of risk and all those things. It really will. So, okay, let's define a CEO. I want you to just talk about this statement Carver made. How is a board complemented by a powerfully designed CEO role? Powerfully designed role, not a powerful CEO.
That they become accountable for everything that works or doesn't work, to me, is where it shows you have a strong CEO or not.
Okay.
And it's if we have given them that authority to do it. It's not necessarily just in their ability to do it, it's in our releasing them to do it.
Okay. And isn't it true when you design a role for a CEO, you are not only empowering them to have a powerful work approach, but you're encouraging them to? Because even though policy governance is about limitations, it's most about, here's the mission, go do. And so if Jared died tomorrow and you had to hire a new one, and you put a design for a CEO in front of someone you're interviewing, and they go, man, this job could be exciting. They've really empowered this person. So, and this theme runs farther throughout the chapter, but why is it then important for the board to speak as one, not individuals? And relate that to the designing of the role of CEO.
Okay. So I'm going to take it back for me, to the car analogy. So you can have two trucks sitting on the parking lot. One of them can have a big V8 in it, and one of them can have a straight six. And they both look good from the outside, but which one's going to do more work? The one that's designed with the bigger engine, it's got all the other things, it's ready to pull, and you won't know it until you see it go. The problem is if you take the spark plug off of 3 of the cylinders in there, then all of a sudden it runs pretty rough, and you have this individual view, and everybody's trying to do their own thing and carry the load, and you've got 3 that aren't carrying the load at all. And so it hamstrings your operation, and things literally, you don't even have 10% of the ability or the power, if you want to use the word power, to complete the task that you have at hand. Whereas if everybody is singular, it's like a smooth running V8, and they can pull a truck, a trailer, they can pull whatever they've got in front of them all over the place, and they can do it successfully and they can do it powerfully because they have designed a powerful engine, the CEO, and they're in tune with that. And so that's the easiest way that I would describe it.
Okay. Any other reasons why you should speak as one?
Because you can only have one boss. And so you can't have 5 bosses. And to me, that was one of the most interesting things that I read was the board members and the CEO individually are colleagues, that they're peers. And that when we go in and visit with him individually, we're there as a peer. We're not there as his boss. We're discussing issues, getting information, trading ideas, but none of us can go in to Jared's office and give him directions of what to do. And that's how we've been operating
It is,
anyway. But I was just fascinated to actually read it in here and say, oh, well, we fell into that. That seemed natural and right. But to go, well, there's a reason for that and there's a purpose for it. And I just found that to be very, very interesting and confirming that that was the proper role and proper approach.
In many cases, it's a challenge. Not every council understands that they do speak as one. Whether they want to speak as one or not, when they actually speak as a body, they speak as one. When they take action behind the dais. Whether it was unanimous or not, they have spoken as one, and that is the guidance to the organization, to the city manager and to the organization. Whether it was 3-2, 4-1, or 5-0, the guidance to the organization was to go forward and do X, or to not do it. And at some point further down the road, and someone says, well, why did y'all do this? You can't say, I didn't vote for it. You know, it's important that you say that the this council absolutely gets it. And most councils get it. But there are times where in other cities that will lock on to, I voted for X. It's not I, it's the council did such. And because that's what the organization is going to hear is what council's direction was. Not, I mean, they'll be aware. We'll always be aware of what the vote was and how it went. And, you know, that does speak a little bit to how, to the freedom to go forward and do that, especially if there's an election coming up. But from a council standpoint, I think it's important to understand that when the council speaks, they do speak as a council. They don't speak as Councilman Smith or Councilman Hayes. They speak as the council.
Well, honestly, when you look at it, is there really supposed to be a difference between a 5-0 and a 3-2 vote anyway? Really? In the end, it's the same. The result will be should be exactly the same.
We're still going to buy the fire truck.
Right. Right.
Or whatever it was.
Right.
Fire truck might not be a good example for a 3-2 vote.
Making the chief nervous again.
Well, and, you know, we may be getting a little off of this, but I think it fits also with our city council code of conduct that we're going to talk about later on, that you support all the decisions of the city council, although an individual member may be on the minority side of the outcome. It's like, this is where we have those discussions and conversations about our differences, but then once that vote is taken, that was the one vote, voice of the council, and that conversation has to end. And from then on, it's, this is what the council decided, and so this is what's happening. And to continue that division and the separation, then you're speaking in multiple voices and basically speaking out of both sides of your mouth.
But that's governance. That's why we are spending the time. This is training. Every month, we set aside time to have governance training. And right now, we're choosing to do it by walking through this book together and having counsel from Bob. But this is why we do governance training, is because it's a skill. It's something we have to practice and get better at, and we can be taught and we can learn how to do it better. When we leave the room after a 3-2 vote, 2 of us are having to decide to exercise our governance muscle. 2 of us are having to say, I will govern on this board. This board will govern as elected to do. And because of that, I will abide by this code of conduct with my speech. I will abide by my code of conduct with my staff interaction. That's governance, and it's a skill, and we're learning it, just like we learned to drive, or we learned
Yes.
to practice law, governance is itself a skill, and that is a challenging governance moment. You're exactly right. The effect of a 3-2 decision in the organization is no different than 5-0, but the governance opportunity, the cost of choosing to govern is a lot more expensive in a 3-2 environment than a 5-0. It costs more. It's a bigger drain on our governance account.
Right. But also think at the same time, that means that we need to be looking at that and have already made the decision before that
Correct.
ever even happens, that this is what is expected of me.
Just like when my dad taught me to drive on ice, you don't slam on the brake, you ease on the brake. And if you feel the wheels go, you turn the wheel in the opposite direction. You get trained into the dangerous situation. A 3-2 vote can be a dangerous governance situation, and we are right now, in advance of that, deciding to turn the wheel into the direction, to stop the slide. That's governance.
It is.
But that you have an open, broad border before that vote is taken. We have so much opportunity here to discuss those things and discuss the different ideas and opinions. And so it does not feel confining to me that once the vote is taken, that's it. Whether I was in the majority or the minority, then you move on. If there was not the opportunity to have expressed those differences or, had those conversations, that would feel very different. But
That's why we have 5 council members instead of 1, because it's the wisdom of many.
or an odd number instead of an even.
Yeah, that's good, yeah.
That's true. I'm jumping ahead, but I want to tag on something you said, Elaine. The concept of, are you more like board, CEO, hierarchy, or are you really cohorts? Are you really people who work together and see each other as equals? You can't. You have a mayor, you have council, and they have ruling responsibilities, and they have to supervise and monitor their one employee. Yet, the way you work and think and attitudes can be different. So, how's that feel?
What do you think, Frida?
Feels great. I mean, we have trust in each other, trust in our employee that works for us. I mean, it's a good feeling, and therefore we can have any discussion that needs to be had, whether the discussion is good or bad. It just makes that conversation easier, but any conversation that you have, you're always going to make sure it's done in more of a diplomacy type method. So.
Jared, do you feel like it's equal?
There's a
Put you on the hot seat?
There's a very collaborative approach to what we do. There's also and sometimes y'all want me to call you certain things. Dr. Sauer would like me to call him Eddie at times.
All the time.
But there are, I think a responsible manager, department head, whatever, is going to recognize the positional authority and treat people with the due respect. But at the same time, we do collaborate to develop a budget. We collaborate to establish what our goals and priorities are. We work together. You are more effective when you have good recommendations from me or from staff. And but we very much do work together as peers, and in many cases we are, for lack of a better word, equals. But I will never presume, to ignore that positional authority, and will always recognize it. And that is a balancing act many times. We can't lose sight of the organizational structure. As well as people may work together, I always have to recognize there's an organizational structure, and I am responsible to you and accountable to you and to the organization. We can't lose sight of the fact that you work for the community, and I work for the organization and the community, and I'm responsible to the people that depend on me, whether it's you, the team, the community. So we are peers, and we do collaborate, but there is an organizational structure there. There's an undertone of we all have our role. So yes and no. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And isn't it a strange dynamic that if you're equal among peers, there are times when you're working that he is the greater among peers because he's smarter than you?
Absolutely.
Much of the time, maybe he should be. That's his career, right? And so you have to exert your power and at the same time let him lead. And that's a tension that you get educated on and grow into. Yeah, absolutely.
But I think there's also this aspect, whenever we consider each other peers, I think there's a higher level of responsibility that we have to each other as peers.
Explain that.
Boy, that's going to be hard to explain.
Not with a car.
No, it really is kind of hard to explain, but I feel like that I expect more out of my peers than out of just somebody else that's just somebody else, or an adversary, or there's this different level that I feel like that I'm supposed to regard them with. If they're a peer, I almost believe like I have a responsibility to listen to them even stronger. Sometimes when it's an adversarial role, you have a tendency to, that's the other side. I'm just going to write that off. I'm not going to listen to that. Whereas if they're my peers, then I have a responsibility to listen, to take in what they have to say, to figure out how does that fit in with what I feel like is, and so therefore I think it takes to another level of making for sure that we're making the right kinds of decisions. So I think there's a lot to be said for the peer status of it. Takes it to, I think it raises it, even though we've got a hierarchy, and that hierarchy, depending upon what's going on, kind of shifts. I mean, with the city manager or with the mayor, but at the same time, whenever you're at this peer level, I think it raises you that there's more expected out of you. I think they expect more out of me than it would if I was their adversary.
More engagement, more listening, more ownership in fixing problems.
Right.
It's a fabulous point, too, because as our familiarity with each other grows and as the confidence in the organization or in the manager grows, so grows the expectation. So grows the expectation for a very frank evaluation. You get a much more direct, there's a lot less hedging of input, behind a closed door. And your confidence in that input goes up or down, conversely. The only time I've had you were talking about challenging board issues. The only time I've really seen one is when I went to an organization as a new city manager, and previous to that point, the council had I like to use the term stump a chump. You know, a director or a staff member would get up to make the presentation, and it was just a peppering of really adversarial questions, because and there's a lot of places for blame to go in that situation. Staff, we haven't prepared council for that presentation. You know, they feel when a council member is asking that peppering question, they are not well enough prepared for that situation, and they're being asked to vote on something that they don't feel equipped, and they feel like they feel underprepared, and it's our responsibility to prepare them. But they were very highly confident of the city manager. But I think really what it was the city manager wasn't taking the steps necessary through staff or with the council to make sure that each was prepared for that interaction. And we have to make sure that there's a clear understanding of, you know, one of the things that I said when I was hired with them was, okay, I won't surprise you, you know, and conversely, you know, I would like y'all to work to not surprise me. And one of the ways we do that is by making sure that everyone has all the information necessary to be able to make any decision they're being asked to make, if possible. Perfect information is hard to find, but good, thorough information is the norm in every situation. So that was an example of a situation where the confidence between board and CEO and organization could have been better. But as we work well together, we work better together. It's an exponential growth, I think.
I heard you say you have a responsibility, or a city manager does, to help the council be successful, and that's by supplying the correct, appropriate, and the right amount of information. And at the same time, your responsibility to help him be successful as a peer is to design a role for him where it makes it easier for him. Just put it that way. So it kind of leads into the next question. It says, explain the concept of cumulative responsibility. And did this section in the book help you, typo, see the vast accountability of the CEO as bigger than you might have seen it in the past?
I'm not sure I caught his definition of responsibility versus accountability, so I kind of wanted to get some feedback on that. I took it that what he was saying is that you're responsible just for yourself. You're accountable for the group. Is that the message?
I had to draw stick figures.
What'd you draw?
So I drew one person that had an arrow that said responsibility, because like what he's personally in charge of, he's responsible for. And then underneath him, I drew two more stick figures, and the arrow coming up through him with those two stick figures is accountability. You know, that's the cumulative responsibility. He has responsibility over them, but it's not his direct personal responsibility. There's my little picture right
That's
there.
it. Yep, that's what I was looking for. But I got it without a picture.
I
That
only
would've
think
helped
in
me.
pictures.
Jared, what does cumulative responsibility feel like to you?
You know, I think there's the definition in the book, which is talking about the relationship between responsibility and accountability for the entire organization. Because when there's a challenge and council identifies a challenge, I'm accountable. I'm responsible for making sure that that challenge is addressed. I'm accountable for what everyone is doing, but I'm responsible for making sure to take care of that problem or that opportunity, whatever it is. But there's also I think, as we grow in confidence with each other, the opportunity for more responsibility presents itself. And that could be in the form of just getting more rope.
Exactly, more freedom.
Maybe
I
I'm given a
agree.
little more freedom, a little more rope, and that can allow us to perform better as an organization, or it can, you know, what they say, when you give someone more rope, they can, you know, create a problem for themselves. But that's you know, I tend not to be wired that way. So, you know, I think that as we grow together and as we have more confidence in each other, we do have the opportunity for, I don't want to say more autonomy, but more opportunity to take legal steps to make the organization more effective. I don't know exactly what that would be, but I know that the way council receives my input now is different from the way council received my input when we first said hello to each other, right?
Sure. I'm watching the time because our discussion leader has an airplane to catch. So it doesn't mean that our discussion needs to end, because there are a couple of more points I want to make sure that we talk about. But Bob, I want to make sure that there's a little break in the conversation where we excuse you.
I think we got 10 minutes
Okay.
for me.
You are just free to, even if we're deep in a point.
Okay.
just-
I don't think I did a good job of defining cumulative responsibility, though. I think that goes to the accountability for the entire organization and how all that piles up. And if you look at the entire organization at one time, that can be a daunting thing to look at.
But I love that idea, though. As I read through the chapter, I'm like, hey, all I have to do is make sure Jared does everything.
Yeah,
And I like that.
that's true.
I can put my head on the pillow at night with that job description for us. And I feel a part of what I like about this chapter and what I hated at the same time is the natural inclination is for us to get in there chilly, for us to want more information, for us to be, well, can we participate in that? It's actually more freeing for us, and we will do our job better if we have defined Jared's role as he's our only employee, and his job is to do everything.
That we have to identify what that end is that we want him to be accountable to do.
Define everything, but his job is to do everything.
Right, and then he figures out all the means and all the in-between stuff, and as long as at the end of the day, he has accomplished what we asked him to accomplish, everything's good.
I think it's very important, those are very flattering things to say, but I think it's very important to note that anytime council feels that something was done well, I hope, I'm very quick to point out, unless it was the organization of my desk, which many times is not me either, I'm very quick to point out that, well, that was so-and-so, and they did a great job on this, they worked on it for this amount of time, they partnered with this employee and this employee and this employee to generate this result. So you have to make sure and shift that praise to the person that really deserves it, and anytime there's a challenge, hey, y'all need to do this better, or you need to do this better, and you're right, I need to do that better. That's, I need to take responsibility for the opportunities, and I need to, recognize the person who's responsible for successes.
And that's assumed, but you're the only employee we have.
True, perfect.
And the five of us have to have that mentality, and it's our job to make sure that as a city, we understand that. As a city, we understand how governance works at the council level so that we have one employee, and it's you.
Yep, true. Many perspectives on the same thing.
Yeah. It's called a discussion.
So just point 2 under implications, the CEO's work is immaterial. Just stop and let that soak in. His work is immaterial. So discuss the statement. The skills sought in a CEO are those associated not with responsibility, but with accountability. So that, I think that kind of summarizes what we've been saying there. We've talked about the colleagues, number 3. Number 4, what reasons might a board member give for not strongly empowering their CEO? And how might all staff be empowered by being given more authority?
Well, in here it says, what reasons might a board member give for now strongly empowering their CEO? What I heard was not.
Yes, you heard not, I'm sorry. I had 2 typos in this.
That's good. Okay, fear is a big reason.
Yeah.
Just say it.
Control.
Yeah.
Or you did a bad job hiring, which I guess you guys didn't really hire him, but I mean, in most situations, we didn't really do our job in the hiring process, so now we have to question everything. Not the case here, but that might be one of the reasons. And so when staff are, how might all staff be empowered by being given more authority? He gave examples of people, when they felt empowered, said, I do better work. I'm more creative. I feel more confident. All those things. So,
And I
explain
think even just realistically, I mean, we have one employee and his job is to do everything, but we all know he can't physically do everything. So he has to empower in order for the city to operate. Obvious statement, but
Yeah. And he took it to an extreme, and I can't say this exactly like he did, but you can't even decide for him what his responsibilities are. We've separated responsibility from authority, because you may have personal, or even as a team, have ideas of, here's what we want our CEO to look like, smell like, act like, but he gets to decide that, unless it's a moral issue or something like that. The way if he wants, here's an extreme, he decides, my schedule is I start at 10 o'clock every morning. You might have an opinion about that, but in the end, if you're monitoring and evaluating on results, big deal,
Doesn't matter.
you know? So that's kind of the day-to-day management idea. And so he is, we might use the term day-to-day manager because every day he's involved in the details, and you shouldn't and don't have to be. However, he is more like you than he is a day-to-day manager. That's the point to be made. So do you think Carver is proposing that a strong CEO looks more like a board member than a staff member?
yeah,
Yes.
I can see that.
Yeah. So I might just leave you with this last one, number 7. Explain the wisdom found in this statement. The CEO position is as invested in having a strong board as in having a free hand. It is a function that, being strong, can afford to bid both board and staff to grow.
Strong board is an engaged board. Been in places where, the board said, well, we have confidence in you, just go do it. We'll look at the budget for 5 minutes and say, well, do we have enough money? Yes. Are we taking care of the things we need to take care of? Yes. I move we approve. You're out on an island, and you haven't worked with your board to really to do it. And when we work together, and I know, and the organization knows, and the community knows that we're on the same page and we're working towards a stated goal and objective, I think we're much more empowered than when we are just moving in a fog without a compass. An engaged board, is an effective board, provides that clear compass for the organization, for the CEO, and also for the organization.
It's good. We're going to keep talking about point number 2.
Okay. Thank you all.
Yes?
See you next time.
Okay.
Safe travels.
Yes, be safe. It's so ironic. It seems like we're just on track here it's a good learning opportunity is to do it wrong and then learn how to do it right, And so I keep thinking, I need to read like 3 chapters ahead on this, and I'll lead better through this. But maybe not. Maybe it's perfectly fine for us to go as far as this is just a learning environment for us, and we're getting it better, and we'll leave it better for the next folks that come along behind us. So, we've just gone through evaluating Jared's performance for the last year, and I think it's so funny because we didn't do it like this guy suggested at all. So I don't want to, though, miss out on the opportunity for us to have a discussion about how we, after reading this, we may want to consider shifting and doing it a little differently next year. So as y'all read that part of the chapter, were there things that you wanted to change about our process? Flipping through there. Like I know I made a note, but let me see where that was. For one thing, I was real struck by this statement that you have to have pre-established criteria in order to do good monitoring. You can't monitor until you have pre-established some criteria. I think we're trying to do that through these policies, and I do think we did that through setting some goals for next year. Did y'all have any thoughts when y'all read through that part?
had the same thought of, oh, I wish we had seen this before, but I felt the same way that we actually learned through that process to have the experience of doing it that way versus this recommended. And we couldn't have done it like this because we had not
We
established.
didn't have those criteria. So looking at item B here, we didn't have criteria for monitoring.
And so, absolutely, I think this is something that I would want to implement before part of our process for next year's evaluation. It is perfect timing for us to determine what are those criteria that we're going to compare against. Because I hope I can find it, but it was that there is no need to discuss personality, procedure, all those different things, methods. None of it is even relevant if you hit the target. How you did it, as long as you did not violate any of these do nots over here, and you accomplished what we asked you to, and you either met the target or you didn't. It's not subjective. It's really like, it's measurable, it's tangible, and so I would really like to see us implement this before next year's evaluation.
I'll say I felt like that we actually set up some criteria by going through this. So I think we're further down the road than we think that we are, actually.
With the goals that we established, you mean?
Yes, we've set some criteria.
And they might be kind of further in the circle than they
Right.
needed to be.
Than they need to be.
Just, that was my thought, was, we went a little, doesn't necessarily mean it's bad,
No.
but I saw those goals a little bit as maybe starts for criteria to monitor. The pillars are good monitoring, and the blueprint is a good document for monitoring.
In some ways, that's kind of how we measured things when we looked back. Or at least I felt like we did.
And that we didn't, looking forward, we weren't necessarily communicating, okay, these are the standards we're going to judge against for next year's evaluation. It was just, to me, more, well, these are some goals, these are some direction, but if it's like, if I know that's what my job performance is judged against, that's very different than it's just a goal.
It's kind of like making it top of mind as opposed to, how everybody talks about bringing things, whether it's advertising or whatever, you want to be top of mind. I think that's kind of what this is saying. So we've had these goals sitting here, but we really haven't set them up as top of mind. So it's just a matter of moving things and deciding which ones we believe should be top of mind, so to speak.
Jared, we told you that one of the goals was to focus on the pillars, focus on the blueprint. Next year's evaluation probably looks like you giving us a state of the city, a state of the blueprint. Before we give you feedback on an evaluation, we probably need, so that you're keeping track during the year of, you're asking yourself, you're asking staff, what are we accomplishing in the blueprint? Because the blueprint is what you're getting measured by at the end of the year.
Right.
That's why we spent all that time doing the blueprint. A substantial amount of staff time went into that. A lot of council time went into that. That document is a fantastic set of criteria for us to measure the city's performance, our employees' performance against. But what that means is y'all need to mentally be thinking now, are you using it as a rubric? Are you using it as measuring yourself and keeping up with, okay, check, we got that done. When it comes around to this time next year and we do a state of the blueprint report to the council so that they can evaluate their one employee, have we kept a record? Have we been checking things off? What do y'all think about that?
I think it's valid.
Well, that was on 168. It says organization performance and CEO performance are the same. And that's basically what you just said.
Well, and as we track performance on pillars, it will be massive. And again, not because I did all or any of it, but because everything that we do as an organization should tie to our pillars in some form or fashion. If it doesn't tie to our pillars, we shouldn't be doing it. Our pillars are both specific and broad because, you know, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And if we're deviating into things that aren't pillars, why are we doing that? You know, because that's what the council said is important. So, you know, we will be tracking and are tracking everything that we do as it relates to each pillar. Now, we also will, you know, we'll have a different tracking document because we now have the pillars, and that's something that you said was, that council said was important, as it should be. But you know, as we present that, you know, next year, you know, state of the city, state of performance, how have we done relative to the pillars? That'll be an example of responsibility versus accountability, you know, because, you know, one of my jobs is to make sure we're always focused on the pillars, that we're doing the things that we said we would do through the budget document and through strategic planning sessions and other things, making sure that we're accomplishing those things in an effective and efficient manner.
Well, also in your manager's report too, we get a lot of information there that will allow us to track, you know, the projects that you all are doing. So,
It's true, it's a little mini
yeah.
report every week.
Which we'll need to bring Mitch in with Human Resources as well as helping us kind of restructure. He was so helpful for us this year and gave us at least some ground rules, but we're changing the ground rules pretty drastically. So to be sure that we get those communicated and that, and then this was 171. It's literally, the other thing we have to come up with is that list of don'ts. The unacceptable actions have to go along with those instructions. It says, what do you charge the organization to accomplish? What do you prohibit the organization from doing? And then how did the organization do against those criteria? That's all we need to turn in. We need that list. This is what we need you to accomplish. This is what you can't do to get there. And then next year be prepared to tell us that this is where we stand based on that list.
I put an exclamation point beside that, too. In this statement, the only judgment that takes place in monitoring is whether actual performance matches a reasonable interpretation of the pre-established criteria. So, again, our job is very simple, deep, but narrow. We're to monitor one employee.
Yes, it's so unique. We have this one employee, but it's saying you don't need to evaluate their skills or personality. It is truly just the accountability of the whole organization. So it's very different. It's very unique. So I really liked this chapter.
As peers, I can see where it might be helpful just, you know, as a friend to say, what about this? You know, what about getting better at that? And that's where being peers can kind of play into that.
It's a different level of responsibility.
But it's not necessarily, did you do your job? The performance evaluation is, did you do your job or did you not do your job?
That, yeah, as a board, we're not tasked with being their coach, the city manager's coach. It's like now on a personal level, as a peer, in a different conversation, that's different. But as a board, that's not our job.
You know, and it is a very numbers-based empirical analysis, but there's also a subjective aspect to it because I can legally do things and I can legally accomplish the same objectives. I get the same results in ways that don't reflect well upon the organization or the community or on you personally. So I think there's an additional metric that is a subjective metric. Are we accomplishing the goals of the council in a way that we can all respect and that our community can respect?
Well, go ahead. You know, I'd like to see input from you as well in regards to the goals and what you and your staff feel like that you can accomplish, or maybe there's some goals that we as council haven't thought about that maybe they could work on too. So we would need that input as well when we start establishing and implementing the goals.
Right. Okay.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Elaine.
I was following up that what I was hearing from you, Jared, is that's the list of don't.
Right. That is true. That is true.
the limitations policy.
Yes, don't do it in a way that reflects poorly on our community. So defining it more clearly, but fits exactly, I think, what you're saying.
What y'all think about the different types of information that they threw out there? He says there's 3 types: decision information, monitoring information, and incidental information. Decision information is what we absolutely have to have in order to make the decision that's in our lane, something we're responsible for. Monitoring information is like what we're talking about in, monitoring whether our employee is getting the job done. The incidental information is everything else. And I just got to thinking about our agendas. I thought, wow, our agendas are full of a lot of incidental information. And so going forward, I just want to commit to you guys that I'm going to try harder to make sure that the type of information we're getting is relevant to the lane that we're in. Because sometimes the problem is the reason I eat too many cookies is because I set the whole plate in front of me. The reason that I can get outside my lane as an elected official on this city council is because I sometimes get too much incidental information. And therefore, then I start giving opinions that
Really don't matter.
don't matter, not mine to give. And I think that's important too. Staff that's in here, keep that in mind, as you guys are bringing things.
And I think we made a lot of progress moving some of that from the regular agenda to the consent agenda, when it really was the decisions have already been made, partly from the policies that are in place of the decision that has to be chosen. Some of those didn't need to be in our lane. They really could be moved over. So I think we made some progress in that
I
from the
agree.
first few
That was
months.
good change, yeah, good change. Okay, anything else? So much good stuff in this chapter. I mean, wish I was getting it all the first time I was reading it, but it definitely has the feel that we'll want to keep. And I want to commit to you guys, we're going to continue doing this. We're going to finish the book, which, woo-hoo, we're crossing the halfway mark this month. I recognize this is a textbook. It is not fun. It is heavy and dry, and it takes a tremendous amount of discipline to read through this book.
It's not an easy read.
And I'm saying this, I did 3 years of law school. I did some pretty dry text. This takes the cake. But thank you for your commitment and your perseverance to doing it, because I'm seeing a lot of fruit just from my chair of it's helping me. And so I appreciate that you're willing to commit the time to do it. And I will tell you, as the chair of this board, I commit that we will, even after this book, we will keep having designated time on our agenda to train us in the governance area, because it's our main thing. And we have to continue to get better at it. And we have to continue to model it for folks that are coming after us, so that we as a city can have the benefit of good governance.
So Mayor, do we actually have 1 employee or 2 employees?
We actually have 2.
So we would need to set up some criteria for Ms. Laura as well as we go through this process. Just wanting to keep that on the
Agree.
forefront so we don't
And
forget.
I wondered if you guys would be interested in having a chat with Laura.
Absolutely.
Just to check in.
Absolutely. I think we should.
Okay. So let me see about how we can go about doing that, but it's a big role that she's taken over, and probably she would appreciate just a chance to visit about how it's going. I bet it's going well. Okay, so let's finish up talking about that, and I have us down for
About 18 minutes over that.
So we've got about 20 minutes. Let's go ahead and pick up our policy on mission and responsibility statements. We've had this in front of us for a few weeks. We haven't spent the time to really look at it and see if there's anything further that we want to change. I want to say to us about all of this, our overreaching goal is to get better in governance. And one of the tools we're using to do that is we're creating a standalone set of policies for our governing board so that as councils come in the future, they'll know right away. They can sit down, they can look at the policies, they'll know better how to stay in their lane and do their job based on the policies. That being said, it's kind of hard to just draft all of these at once. It's an overwhelming thing. So it's oftentimes, as I counsel young couples or married couples about wills, you know, they reach a high center point where they're like, I don't know, I just can't decide anymore. I'm tired of talking about it. Let's just not sign it. And I always push there and I say, no, let's sign something. And if a week from now you absolutely can't live with what you signed, no biggie, we'll change it. Yeah. But we can't lock down and getting everything perfect and have nothing, because we're far better off with something than we are with nothing. So I have to keep telling myself that as we're working through all of these things, because we put it on paper and then we read something in the book and it makes me want to go back and make it better. We're going to get a chance to go back and make it better. We're going to put all of these on a calendar so that we look at them at least once a year. And every year we'll have the chance to come back through them, look at them, what's working, what's on here, but we're not implementing. What are we learning better about policy governance that we need to shift it? So I don't want us to get in the mode, and I'm talking to myself, that it has to be perfect before we put it down and move on. Some of the things I know that are really, we started with this one, I felt like it was really top of the list important. Now I'm starting to feel the pressure that we need a limitations policy, and we need to move on and talk about a limitations policy. So while we could spend another week or two talking about this one, and if y'all want to, we will, I'm laying the predicate for let's move off of this and move on to the next, to the limitations policy and the list of other policies that I know we currently need to get into written form. Okay, with that predicate.
And when you say move on, to go ahead and approve these and move on.
I think so.
I would like that. I would like to
Okay.
start closing some of those loops, and like, see, we can come back around if we don't feel like we got it right the first time. There's no contract signed that we
No.
can't come back and change it.
Right.
Come back to
But
it for another 2 years.
I support. I need to start checking off some things
Good.
and move on to the next, so I'm totally supportive of that.
Okay.
Me too.
What do you guys
I'm
think?
good.
Okay.
I think we spent plenty of time, honestly, on,
The temptation is to, today we talked about, well, we shouldn't define what city manager's responsibilities are. Well, big as Dallas, there it is, city manager responsibilities. The spirit of it is that we're not telling him day to day how to do things, but there are 9 things that we're saying generally, this is the circle we want you to play in. We've called it responsibilities though, so,
And again, we can change that circle, so.
we can, but it's probably best to change it in a year from now after we've gone around the horn.
I think the responsibilities are pretty well.
Yeah, I like them.
They're kind of set. The things that we talked about, the city mission and some of those other things, the basic responsibilities, when we touched on those, I think that pretty well kind of cleans that one up pretty good.
And we did change the city mission statement. I
Yes.
love that. I'm getting more comfortable saying it. I need to print this out so I remember how to say it. And I think the previous council had put a lot of this on paper, and so we've just tweaked a few things, but, they had done some plowing before
Sure.
to come through and get this in writing, and I'm very comfortable with, as is, with the changes that you've identified so far.
I think I might say in number 5, it says hire, terminate, and supervise. Let's say monitor. Wordsmithing totally, but since we're pushing into this policy governance, and I think that's an important
I'm good with that.
term. Okay. Any other comments on that? If not, then we'll get that on an agenda to approve. And if y'all are okay, then I think we'll take a stab next at a limitations policy.
I might say hire and monitor, because we do have the responsibility of hiring.
Oh, yeah. I was
It says
thinking
hire,
hire,
terminate,
terminate, and monitor.
Oh, okay.
No, good. I'm
We're
glad.
not taking them in order, are we?
Yeah.
I
I'm not
don't think she
taking
said
those in
that.
order. Is that what you said? Right.
Oh,
no.
okay, you were adding that. I was
Yeah.
like,
Really
well,
didn't
we have
say
to
that.
hire them
Change and
first, then
supervise.
monitor.
Yeah.
My bad, sorry.
No, I'm
with
glad
you.
you clarified it. Okay. So see, we made up some time there, a little bit. Okay. With that, then, we'll move on to item A4, which is receive a presentation on the airport rules and regulations. I think you each have a,
We've got our operations director, Thomas Oscarson, or did I get your name right? Operations manager?
Yes, sir. So, Mayor, council members, Mr. Miller, my name is Thomas Oscarson. I'm the assistant director out at the airport, and I'm privileged today to present to you a set of draft airport rules and regulations. Unfortunately, Mr. Connor couldn't make it today. He's out of town. But being part of this process since 2015, I feel confident that I can provide you some context and information moving forward. And if I don't have the answer for you, I know some people who can get it over to you, and then we'll expand on that if necessary. So as I alluded to, some background information on the rules and regulations. They were by and large a conglomerate of different policies and regulations that the previous director, Sarah Fries, reached out to me and said, you know, we need to get our regulatory house in order. We need to get organized with our minimum standards, our airport master plan, and also our rules and regulations. The rules and regulations were not previously drafted before. They were regulations that were either in ordinance or in other governing documents provided to the airport through other federal standards. So Sarah reached out to me. She said, this seems to be something that you have an interest in. Please spearhead this, act as the facilitator, and then help to coordinate the actions necessary to bring these documents to fruition.
So we've never had a consolidated document.
The rules and regulations were not consolidated, no. They were found in different documents throughout the regulatory binders at the airport.
We feel your pain.
Well, and that's very similar to the challenges we have with our zoning ordinance and things like that.
And that was a discussion that we had when we moved through, and we talked about, well, what were the development objectives for these type of rules? And one question we had to ask is, how do we bring about an atmosphere that creates an area for compliance? The answer to that is transparency, a consolidated document that is easy for the public to digest, or for those who need to get this information. It comes in a consolidated document that hits a lot of the broad strokes throughout all the facets and different regulatory bodies that affect the airport. So we started off with the minimum standards. They were completed last year around the December timeframe. The rules and regulations are different in the sense that they do not, well, as the minimum standards specifically, affect commercial aviation activities, airside, the rules and regulations have an effect on both airside and landside operations. They affect operators, they affect lessees, subleasees, and to a small extent, the traveling public. Some examples of that. So if we're talking about the traveling public, smoking where to park your vehicle, conduct and standards, that sort of thing. If you're traveling with animals, what rules pertain to that? Weapons. Moving through, we created a section called General Airport Rules and Regulations. So these were rules and regulations that in and of themselves weren't large enough to create an individual section within this document, but gave voice to the idea that they provided safety or operational necessity. So, and in the creation of this, one of the objectives I think that I neglected to mention was we wanted these rules to be pertinent to today's standards, necessary, and then transparent, so that we can garner the buy-in from the general public, and then the reassurance that there is the regulatory body or the compliance there to create an orderly environment at the airport. Okay, aircraft operating regulations. Aircraft operating regulations, this section of the rules and regulations pertains to maintenance engine runs, when that would be allowable, security standards as they're applied uniformly across the airfield, general operating guidelines and standards, and then taxiing and towing operations and how that is supposed to be done, give in mind aircraft emergencies when that takes place, and then those individuals that are participating in these activities are aware and understand that certain procedures will then take precedent over certain aircraft operations. Aircraft operating regulations pertain to commercial carriers, those that are operated either as a 121 or a 135 air taxi type operation, but also to the general aviation operator, to give them a framework or an understanding that when these rules are developed, they are developed for individuals who may be less accustomed to operating in a fairly busy environment, such as we have out at our airport, and then as it continues to grow. Okay. General terminal building rules. This was not previously placed in any regulatory document at the airport. This is something that was expanded upon as we start to build out and develop the rules and regulations. These rules pertain to general housekeeping standards for terminal users. So whether it's the airlines or people facilitating airline work, maintenance in the facility, the terminal facility, or a discussion or the use of shared use equipment, these rules outline standards and conducts that are expected by the airport. Okay, airfield vehicle rules. These rules primarily stem from FAA regulation, and they build out depending on how far the vehicle proceeds out onto the airfield. So there's a tiered approach to that. They specifically pertain to lessees, sublessees, and contractors and operators out on the airfield. These are enforced FAA regulations for signage and training requirements, and we echo those in this document. We thought that that would be pertinent to include. Commercial vehicles. This is an aspect that represented a significant change from previous documents. Sometime last year, and I believe it was later in 2017, the Texas legislature introduced House Bill 100. With the advent of that, it took away municipal authority to regulate transportation network companies. However, within that regulation, there was a carve-out for ports to regulate transportation network companies. These are the Ubers and the Lyfts and those individuals who use an application on their phone for commercial purposes. In looking at that regulation, we worked with our consultant as well as city legal to draft ordinance that shows the regulated authority that is embodied within the airport to regulate transportation network companies. And then after completing that ordinance, we use the rules and regulations to explain the how. So the ordinance kind of pointed towards this is the authority that's available to an airport or a port. But then we continued with how this process is going to be administered. And that is found in the rules and regulations and within the commercial vehicle rules. This covers permitting requirements, fees, operating standards for all commercial vehicles. Slide 7. So, rules for commercial operators, and this is an expanded facility requirement for tenants and lessees. So as we look around the vast expanse that is the airport, whether you're an FBO like TAC Air, or you're a commercial operator like Budget, or we're talking about a flight school, these rules and regulations within this section apply to the facilities that are around the airport that are owned and operated by the airport. And finally, aviation fueling. This section covers fueling regulations in accordance with NFPA standards. Recently, the airport adopted the 2017 edition of NFPA 407. Since that has been enacted within our airport certification manual, we thought it prudent to include these standards for fueling both non-commercial and commercial type activities within the rules and regulations. This is something that's required by the FAA and then further establishes training standards as a tiered approach depending on whether or not this is a for hire or for commercial use type fueling operation, or if it is something to a lesser extent, which is non-commercial fueling standards. With that, I have covered each section of the rules and regulations, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
And this will be in front of you for action. This will be in front of you for action at a subsequent meeting, assuming we don't have any substantive questions that we need to take time-consuming steps to address.
Thomas, on the area of like regulations on animals, transportation, do the airlines, like you're setting the big box, do they have their own standards within that? Are they stricter? Are our airport rules? Do we dictate the individual airlines? What is that relationship?
Councilmember Hayes, thank you. By and large, there are federal standards for the shipment of animals. A lot of times, the airlines will elect to carry a higher standard than the federal standard to provide them a little more latitude in what they're allowed to do. The current standards that we have represent a federal standard. So if we're talking about SARA, and I'm sorry, the acronym is eluding me right now. That is the service animal and relief area. So these standards are set up for all airports that are commercial use, and then we provide these services to the airlines. But in and of themselves, the airline also has a set of federal regulations that they have to adhere to when transporting animals.
So would you say that the majority of your rules were mainly looking at those federal, finding out what the requirements are, and getting them all down, just compiled in one
That's
area?
Right. So this is a compilation and a consolidation of rules and regulations, whether we're talking from a federal standpoint, state, even down to a local municipal code.
Mm-hmm. So it's really, this is for the purpose of a resource.
This is a condensed document, yes.
We weren't necessarily creating our own rules and coming up with our own things. It's just trying to consolidate everything into one area.
Yes, ma'am, that is correct. When we issued the task order and the notice to proceed, we continued with we selected a consultant by the name of Aviation Consulting and Management Group. They put out to the airport a request for information and documents. We then provided these documents, whether it is the airport's certification manual or the airport security program, and gave them about 3 months to digest this information. Within the course of that is when they brought out their first draft. The document that is before you today is actually the 6th revision of this document. So it has been scrutinized by airport staff, by city legal, to a large extent, and rightly so. It's important that we do our due diligence when applying these regulations.
And also under the commercial vehicle rules, and you talked about the Ubers and taxis and some new rules that the legislature allowed. And when we were discussing that ordinance that you're referring to, we had some public comment and some feedback from some of those private owners and stuff. And so just before we get to a point where we're needing to vote on this, if you wouldn't mind to just provide me an update on that, of how that impacted this and kind of where we settled on how we're overseeing the taxis and Ubers. That may be more from you, Mr. City Manager, or just...
We can make sure that this document reflects whatever changes we make on the ride-sharing companies.
Yeah, I just needed an update of where we landed on that, if that had been finalized, where it actually landed from what it was first recommended to the comments. So, but just, I don't need that right now. I'm just asking for that at some future point.
That ordinance was ratified and accepted, and after that ordinance was completed, we then revisited the airport rules and regulations just to bounce back and forth to check that the two documents were communicating with each other appropriately.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
No other questions? Mr. Oscarson, thank you so much for coming today to give us a report.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
We appreciate your work at the airport.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on then to item A5, which is a presentation by Stephen Adams on our upcoming debt issuances. Mr. Adams, welcome back to Amarillo.
Did everyone get a handout on? Okay, perfect. So Stephen Adams, as you all know, he's here just to go over several of the debt issuances that we're looking at going forward with in a couple of months. And then we have one action item later on today's agenda that he'll review slightly on that.
Mayor, members of the council, if you have this, we have 4 different debt issuances. They all have kind of gone through their own legal path or various ways to get to a point, but we want to sell them all at a meeting on June the 19th. And the reason we come today is that one of the issues, the certificates of obligation, is the one that has an action item on your city council meeting. To issue certificates of obligation, it requires 2 publications in the local newspaper and the council cannot act to sell them until 30 days after the first publication. So we're going to publish on the 3rd and the 10th, and that comes back on the 19th that you can sell the certificates of obligation. And just kind of going through the list, the certificates of obligation are being sold to fund improvements at public improvement districts, and they will be repaid from assessments of those public improvement districts. And so the city has historically gone through a process where after the public improvements are developed, that it will pay for certain improvements that are otherwise not fundable. They're public improvements, but the city wouldn't otherwise pay for them. It might be greenways or nicer streetlights or streeting or lighting systems. But when they do it, the city has in the past issued COs so that they would have a very low interest rate, but the assessments of the residents within those communities, within those districts, actually pay the COs. The general obligation bonds, it's the second issue of the referendum that we did in 2016. We have broken that up, if you recall, into 3 separate issues, and we issue them based on tax rate management and cash flow need based on the projects. There are 2 issues of water and sewer revenue bonds. One is being sold to the Texas Water Development Board at a subsidized rate, which, probably be in the 2% range, maybe lower, depends on the interest rates at that time. We've gone through a process where we applied to the Water Development Board for certain projects that are eligible for Clean Water State Revolving Fund loans, which are federally subsidized. So you go through this process. The city did that. The Water Development Board, their board, has approved a commitment to buy bonds from the city, and so now the city has to sell the bonds to the Water Development Board at that subsidized rate. In addition to that, there are other water and sewer revenue projects that are not being sold to the Water Development Board, but on the 19th, as with the GOs and the COs, we'll take competitive bids and sell revenue bonds for other projects. And for all of the GO projects and the water and sewer revenue bond projects, those are all in your budget. And I think we'll be coming to the city with exactly what those projects are a little bit later after they're finalized. There are certain movements of the projects and what's ready to be funded that goes on, but they're all in the budget. With that, if we sell all these on June the 19th, as with all of your debt, the Attorney General has to approve it, and that process will occur after you award all these various bond issues, and we will close on or about July the 18th. Now, I have for each of these detailed timelines that we can go through. So, for example, this first timeline on page 2, it's for the certificates of obligation. And again, this one will have action tonight where you'll authorize those publications, which will occur on the 3rd and the 10th. We will have to get ratings on 3 of these, not for the Water Development Board, but for the 3 market issues. We will go through a rating process, and we will then receive our ratings, and we'll put all the bond documents out for competitive sale, and we'll take those in the mornings. All 3 of the sales will be bid out in the morning and then brought to the council that afternoon. The water and sewer revenue bonds we have on the next page, and there's kind of 2 bond issues running parallel. The Water Development Board, if you look at the June 13th Wednesday date, they will actually give us your rate 1 week prior to your council meeting. And so, and no sooner, because they're also subject to interest rate risk as well, because they've sold bonds to buy these bonds. The market issue will get bids again the morning of the 19th, and then award on June the 19th. And that is it. If you go to page 5, that's it for the calendars. This is just kind of graphically the existing debt and the 2016 bonds, which are being sold in equal parts graphically. And the key thing there to note is that your debt falls off in about the 2026 time frame. Whenever, at that time, it should be, you should have plenty of capacity for another GO bond if the city needs something at that time without a rate increase. And then page 6 is all that information of the bond issues numerically, if you like looking at things that way. So we have the 18 issue that we already did, the 19 issue, the 20 issue, and then finally a 2021 issue. And that will culminate the sale of all your authorized debt. And then if you move to page 8, that's just the sources and uses of the GO bonds. You'll have $21,775,000 in projects, and then $140,000 for the cost of issuance. And if you want to stop and ask any questions, feel free. I know there's a lot of information here.
And that 21.7 total issuance of 21.9 is going to pay for the general obligation from the 2016 bond election, right?
Right.
The projects for year 2 of that project, those projects.
And that was a total of, what was that total exactly?
21.7 in projects, 21.9 in issuance, 140,000 is the cost of debt.
The overall, the 2016 approved debt was, we're piecing it out because we just can't physically operate it all at once.
Correct. Over a
but
5-year period, we'll begin all of those projects over a 5-year period.
the big total was,
It's almost 110, I believe.
yeah, 110.
And you said over 5 years, we're purchasing those over 5 years. From the 2016, we're staggering it
It's
in
a
5 pieces.
It's a 5-year program, correct. And for a couple of reasons. One, tax rate management. Number 2, you just can't process that much money that fast.
We can't spend
that many
a
roads.
project, we can't get things built that quickly.
Right.
No need to borrow
Why
in year
borrow
one.
it if, yeah.
Correct. And, you think one project's going to start and it'll run to an issue and you've got to move another one and those kinds of things. And so it was scheduled to do this way. And so this is the second, and we'll have 3 more after this, each summer, give or take. And on page 10 is the debt service on the certificates of obligation. Again, that's going to be paid by the assessments of the Public Improvement District. It's 20-year level debt, and we have 3.85 for an interest rate. There's a cushion in there